As we continue to look at the way the Roman Empire propagated itself and spread, the importance of architecture in service of that ideology and goal and conquering other civilizations is key. And let's also keep in mind the contrast between Roman and Greek. Culture and the continuation in some instances of archaeology, but also their inherent structural differences. Greek culture consisted of these discrete individual city-states. It was not an empire. It was more about multiple individual places that were united in a sense by, in an overarching sense, by Greek ideals. And governance occurred through the management of individual city-states, in contrast to the Roman Empire. As it expands into the Middle East, the kind of energy that the Romans invest into exporting, partially through architectural creations such as the aqueduct, into northern Africa, into the Middle East. Here we see at that time the Imperial Roman Empire. Again, this replication of buildings all over that empire. And the way that an emperor's visage on a coin can also convey the presence of a ruler to the Middle East, to a place in northern Africa, places that might never see this conquering ruler in person, is something that will occur in the future. But just now to implant the idea of coinage, of how the idea of money, of coins, will serve in how societies reinforce their dominance, their imperialistic dominance. Romans replicated these buildings all over the empire, arches, theaters, like the Colosseum. What were they using? What was so important in that endeavor? Concrete. Here we see something known as the Arch of Titus from an aerial perspective. The Arch of Titus is another example of this kind of a rounded arch architecture that we see in the aqueducts and in the Colosseum. So again, this Roman arch is the foundation of Roman building and is far more flexible, useful in spanning and joining two separate foundations through space than the earlier post and lintel architecture. Very few structures historically are more well-known, are more famous than the Colosseum, right? Colosseum is the place where Nero once stood. And again, the architectural significance of structures and how they embody the idea of empire. Aqueducts, again, the idea of a rounded arch, channeling water from hills and mountains through gravity. And in the Colosseum, we see another use, architecturally speaking, of rounded arches that spans a substantial space that can house many people. What happened in the Colosseum? Blood sports. The Colosseum is known as what? Most famously as a blood sport arena for entertainment. Gladiator games. If you're a gladiator, the idea is to get in and out of that arena as quickly as possible if you want to live. They also could fill the bottom of the Colosseum at that time with water, and they would have these mock sea battles. So it was sort of in a sense, an empire of spectacle, and reinforces this idea of Roman supremacy and agency. And again, plays on this idea of statecraft, of empire both at home and importing it. We don't see much of it intact anymore. Why is that? Because people quarried it out. Like bronze that we saw earlier that ended up being reused so much, the Colosseum in part is dismantled. There are these, however, subterranean passageways beneath the original floor structure of the Colosseum. These were used for what? For soldiers to travel underneath in this passageway before above ground entering the arena of the Colosseum, to transport animals that were used in these endeavors. If you think about movies, Ridley Scott's movie Gladiator, those sorts of fights, they were actually, in many of those, in that film in particular, and a few others, depicted fairly accurately from what historians know. Then we get to a point where the rounded arch, so prevalent in the Colosseum, is transformed into a dome. How can we think of that from a structural standpoint? An arch that's rotated, let's say 360 degrees. This is a Roman invention. How do we think of this when we consider the Pantheon versus the Parthenon? What comes first? Right, the Parthenon, and here's the Roman Pantheon. The Pantheon is the finest intact imperial Roman temple. And it's important to say intact because it has served different purposes. It was a Christian church. Christianity's home was in Rome. It was partially destroyed, then preserved. And when we think about such structures, not specifically the Pantheon, but others that serve different purposes over time, in this early part of July in the year 2020 at the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, originally a church that was turned into a cultural museum, is now under petition to become a mosque, which it also was once in an earlier incarnation. So we see the way that these sorts of structures can also serve, be more fluid in terms of the ideology and the religion that they are serving. Inscription is a very important element in a Roman temple. And what does that inscription give us? It creates a genealogy, a history that honors an emperor or previous emperor. The back of such a structure, and here we are looking at the oculus or the eye of the Pantheon, which is quite a remarkable feature, witnessed inside, looking up at it. This idea of being perfectly domed, in an aerial space that is always open. And again, the material of concrete, which is durable, and although it's heavy, not too heavy. Something invented by the Romans, combination of a few different substances that creates something that today we know as relatively inexpensive, highly useful, flexible in terms of its use. Here we see the oculus today and in a more historical representation. Concrete is also what allowed the Romans to be so prolific in their building, to lay down roads. They weren't cutting stone, which of course is incredibly time consuming. And with the addition of lime, this rendered this material stone-like, but lighter and cheaper. The Pantheon also serves as example of Roman problem solving and illustrates their prowess, their great facility as engineers. If we think about the Greeks and how the Greeks constructed temples, the Romans changed that. They pushed the boundaries of engineering in ways that are not necessarily meant as Greek temples were, to solely serve religion, to serve a godhead. So the result, this dome with walls that incorporates this idea of arches, is one that is really fundamental to Roman architecture. The idea of the warts and all verism approach to portraiture, again, just quickly looking at this idea of representation and the importance of the imperial portrait to far-flung parts of the empire as well. And the way, again, that Augustus has himself depicted here. Youthful, virile. He's got like the build of a Greek athlete, fighting as a gladiator in the Colosseum, even though at the time the statue was made, he was middle-aged. So it's like this idea of, in a sense, sleight of hand. He's portrayed as youthful and flawless. Not only is he an excellent orator along the lines of the orator that we see depicted earlier, but he's a military victor. And there's this idea of Cupid. There's also on his breastplate almost ID badges. These are gods representing the fact that he is this bringer of Pax Romana, this peace, through his prowess, his accomplishments as an international military emperor. And there are personifications on that breastplate also of the gods of Apollo and Diana, major gods, major deities in the Roman pantheon. And again, the Cupid figure at the bottom riding a dolphin. Wonderfully, symbolically, the dolphin becomes a symbol of Augustus's great naval victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra, a battle that made Augustus the sole ruler of the empire. And again, that idea that he's descended from the gods because Cupid is the son of Venus, the Roman goddess of love. So this statue in particular that we looked at earlier in part one, we're looking at again, just to emphasize the way that one architectural representation or one statue through its portraiture can so succinctly and variously be so potently representative. Looking at portraiture, continuing, looking here at Marcus Aurelius, the equestrian statue, we are faced with what? A leader, a ruler addressing his troops. As emperor, he's in charge of not all things military, but of everything within the empire. He's very intentionally bearded and wearing the toga to point to the fact that he also is a ruler who engages in intellectual and academic pursuits. But he, at the same time as he is portrayed in his emperor role. This is one of the first of several similar statues that were not, this is one of the few that were not melted down when some of these statues were melted down. And when we consider these sorts of representations of military prowess, authority, and of leadership, it's hard not to be mindful of, to be put into the mind of thinking about the way that statues in this day and age are being reconsidered and reanalyzed from a perspective that is more inclusive of more than one kind of history. If we think about Charlottesville today, of General Lee, if we think about Napoleon and the kind of propaganda that that represents. So we go from Marcus Aurelius, who is sometimes thought of as the last of the good emperors, to his son, Commodus. If you thought that your offspring wasn't good enough at this time, it was not uncommon in Rome to adopt someone else and make them the emperor. When you get to Marcus Aurelius, you've got a pretty good ruler, and who has this kind of stark, raving, mad son, Commodus, who becomes emperor. He changes the names of the month to his name. He changes the name of Rome. He walks into the Roman Senate as he is portrayed in this sculpture here as Hercules, before eventually the deep state kills him. No, this guy's not doing it for us. What is he wearing? He's wearing this lion head. He's holding apples in his left hand that are supposed to be from the underworld. So this is quite a remarkable statue in a sense. In the sense that Commodus is not just playing Hercules, but he really thinks he is Hercules. And we can see that in this mosaic. The Romans just had no use for him. When we get to thinking about, if we turn to rather thinking about the movies, The Gladiator, how Commodus is portrayed in that, if any of you have seen that, well, in a way you can just chalk that up perhaps to inbreeding, but certainly it was a memorable character that Joaquin Phoenix portrayed. With the Tetrarchs, we are looking at quite a different phase of portraiture, of representation, right? We're looking at the Roman empires at a somewhat of a crisis and deciding that the solution needed to be one that was divided into the eastern and western halves of rulership, and that each of those halves would be ruled by two men in tandem, known as the Tetrarchs. So we're going from this idea of Greek and Roman portraiture to these not very individual looking at all, certainly not like the Roman busts, heads we looked at, the idea of verism. We're looking at these oversized heads and eyes that are not very individually specific. And this shift, particularly with something like the way these eyes are depicted, oversized, away from naturalism, the attention to physiognomy of the person, of the individual, is going away. And we turn the corner to the Middle Ages, a time when human likeness is not going to be that important in terms of depiction as it earlier was. Constantine the Great, who we'll finish up with, is part of this idea of one of the tetrarchs. He takes his army, he faces off with another tetrarch, and there is a battle. Constantine is in a bid to bring the entire empire under him. And he has a dream a very important dream in which he hears a voice saying, with this sign, by this sign you will conquer. And this sign, known as the Cairo symbol, is Christ's name done up in a monogram. Constantine puts the symbol on soldiers' uniforms and shields, and he is victorious in this battle. At which point he says, we have been killing Christians and taking their property, and he issues something called the Edict of Milan, a new rule, an important rule that we'll review in our next chapter and on our next lecture guide, that tells Rome you can no longer kill Christians and take their property. So this doesn't make Romans Christians, but what it does do is set in motion the demise of Rome as the center of the Roman Empire. Constantine's edict, his law, moves the capital to what? To what we knew of in the past as Constantinople.